The seveso disaster, Italy. The objectives for today are to identify the disaster in Seveso, Italy, the health effects on women and children, women's health study, long-term effects of dioxin exposure. Our table of contents are the Figure 1 timeline of events, Figure 2 map of Seveso, Figure 3 pie chart, and Figure 4 table of health outcomes, Figure 5 temporal line graph, Figure 6 TCDD levels in women. And the summary, what does the future look like for those affected by this environmental disaster? Timeline of events from explosion to health outcomes. In 1976, the chemical cloud containing dioxin, also known as TCDD, a harmful carcinogen to human and wildlife, spread to over 2,000 civilians because of the explosion at the chemical plant due to a leaky valve. Near Seveso, Italy, up to 30 kilograms of TCDD were released into the atmosphere and 3,000 kilograms of chemicals total spread all in a chemical cloud. In 1982, the Seveso Directive was implemented by the European Council Directive to conduct the flow of information necessary for safety issues. They required that each member state, which is each country that belongs to the European Union, must appoint a competent authority to overlook all safety issues, ultimately developing the standards for risk management and safety regulations. In 1983, about 7 years after the initial explosion, reproductive health was first recognized as a negative health outcome due to dioxin exposures to Seveso residents. About 13 years to follow, in 1989, 193 cases were reported of children having chloracne, and more health outcomes reported were people experiencing peripheral neuropathy and liver enzyme induction. Cardiovascular mortality rates increased in the affected populations who were exposed to dioxin poisoning after the explosion. And in 1996, a historic cohort study was conducted 20 years after the explosion to study women's health. This study included blood samples of the woman impacted directly from the explosion, along with anthropometric and blood pressure measurements, personal interviews with questions that touch on reproductive health and medical history. And in 2014, the Seveso second generation study was conducted to measure the health effects of in utero dioxin exposure in the children from the Seveso Women's Health Study participants of 1996. In 1976, the Seveso disaster. Here's a map that shows the zones hit by the cloud made up of sodium hydroxide, ethylene glycol, sodium trichlorephenate, and about 15 to 18 kilograms of dioxin. People living in these zones experienced nausea, headaches, and eye irritation, and about 19 children were hospitalized for skin lesions. After several weeks, hundreds of animals and plants died in surrounding areas. These zones were formulated by a residence matrix based on systematic sampling and measuring of the surface soil TCDD levels. Zone A, right here, housed 736 residents with about 15.5 to 5,477 micrograms per meter squared TCDD, and were evacuated immediately from their homes, and later these homes were demolished during the cleanup of the hazard. Zone B housed about 5,000 residents and were not evacuated but advised against consuming any local grown products. And Zone R, which housed 31,800 residents, were not evacuated since they had the least exposure. They were just advised not to eat local grown food products. And health outcomes, about 7 years after the explosion, reproductive health was observed as an outcome to dioxin exposure. This is because the sex ratio of births drastically changed, with 46 females being born to 28 males. Dioxin exposure is now seen as a hormone disruptor, and TCDD causes fetal loss and reduced birth weight in animal studies. Health outcomes in children exposed. The photo in the upper right corner is a child from Seveso experiencing chloracne because of dioxin exposure. Figure 4 is a condensed representation of data collected from the National Library of Medicine because of case control studies conducted in the years to follow the chemical explosion. Chloracne is a health outcome found in children who are exposed, with up to 200 cases under the age of 15. 48.1% of children who were in Zone A were diagnosed with chloracne. A case control study was done to find if this was due to TCDD exposure or if they were more susceptible due to TCDD exposure. With a sample of 101 cases and 211 controls, TCDD was found in higher levels among the cases, confirming exposure as a factor in chloracne being a health outcome. Liver function of children was measured with those who had chloracne in Zone A with 31 samples aged 6 to 8 years old, finding that children with chloracne had extremely elevated levels of D-glucaric acid, and D-glucaric acid is a biomarker of exposure to toxins in the body, which with elevated levels of these samples indicates exposure to dioxin and can increase risk for malnutrition. Immune function was tested with children from all 3 exposed zones. Using phytohemagglutinin and pokeweed to measure lymphocyte responses, resulting in unregular cellular immunity. 463 women were tested in fertility, which was found to decrease TCDD exposure. With increase in TCDD exposure, there was also a 25% increase in time to pregnancy associated. These samples of women's fertility, along with the discrepancy in sex at birth, led to the conduction of the Seveso Women's Health Study, one of the most significant in history. Seveso Women's Health Study, a cohort study, shown in Figure 5, is a line graph with data conducted periodically from the start of the explosion until about 2016. This was done to monitor reproductive effects on women's fertility and gain better understanding and how this will affect long-term health outcomes. In 1996, 981 females were tested using blood samples aged 0 to 40. Individual interviews on perception of health and anthropometric testing were also conducted in the study. 83% of data is retrieved from Zone B, as this was more populated, and Zone A has less participants. Findings indicate that 71% of the participants were postmenarchal, meaning their menstrual cycle already began at the time of explosion. 38% were porous, meaning they were pregnant during the explosion, and less than 1% were postmenopausal, meaning reproduction system is no longer active. Overall, the line graph is showing that over the years, fertility and menstrual reproductive systems declined until 2014. Measuring samples at the time of explosion and indicating number of pregnant and fertile women are a significant lead into the second generation Seveso Women's Health Study. In 2014 and 2016, the data on the graph is then presenting the number of participants from the offspring of the original study from 1976. This data is presenting the lowest numbers at Zone A being 123 and Zone B being 582 total number of children born from the women of the original cohort study. The Seveso Women's Health Study continued with Figure 6, a bar graph to represent the initial data blood samples taken in 1976 to measure TCD levels in women, later reported on during the Seveso Women's Health Study. Zone A's medium TCDD levels show higher in women with participants N equals 981 at 272 parts per trillion, and Zone B is 47 parts per trillion. The variation of TCDD levels represents total chemical substances for 981 participants in each zone to measure confounding variables or misconstrued data for non-bias. Zone A has TCDD levels reading at a variation from 3.2 to 56,000 parts per trillion, and Zone B has levels of 3.2 to 3,1400 parts per trillion. Results prove that Zone A residents were more exposed to TCDD, and variation data explains there is possibility for TCDD exposure miscalculations at the time of initial blood samples being taken, because it was taken from the soil and then blood samples were taken further down the line. So just a summary, zones were initially made to subjugate individuals exposed to dioxin based off soil levels of TCDD, and then later on blood samples were taken, which is what these studies are using for their data. And then later on, when the sex-birth ratios became huge discrepancies, they realized that women's hormones might be affected by dioxin exposure, which is later on what the Women's Health Study is based on, and that's why they are measuring how many women were already starting their period or were pregnant, because that'll later on affect generations to come if they can still conceive. So Zone A has the most impact of dioxin exposure and therefore the most vulnerable population of women for generations to come. And these are my references. They're footnoted at the bottom of each slide, and then in the bottom right corner, you will see the slide numbers. Okay, thank you.